was a senior in high school when my mom began attending a Pentecostal church. We had never been churchgoers in the past. Not really, anyway. We occasionally went to my grandmother's Methodist church, and my father, who's a devout Muslim now, took us only a few times to the mosque with him. So a Pentecostal church was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. People raised their hands while singing what felt like love songs, and some even danced in the aisles. And the pastor was angry. Very angry. My anxiety would build throughout his sermons and reach a fever pitch toward the end, because I knew what was coming next. His preaching followed a sort of script, and each time he would finish by calling the unsaved up to the altar. He'd remind us that we were sinners, and we could die at any time, maybe even on the way home from church. And if we didn't accept Jesus right then, we would end up burning in hell for all eternity. I usually had to excuse myself before he got to that part. For many years, I'd had a caregiver in my life who told me how bad I was, how worthless and unlovable, how I didn't even deserve to be alive. The message from the pulpit, it tracked with what I was already being told at home, confirming my belief about myself, that I was fundamentally broken. But this message also provided a solution. If I would just believe the right things, I could be fixed. After a few months at that church, I decided to go to the altar. An older woman with cropped gray hair lovingly put her arm around me and walked me to the front. Kneeling down beside me, when I told her I didn't know if I was sure I believed, she said, "It only takes a little bit of belief." And so together, we prayed the sinner's prayer. I was euphoric that afternoon. That same woman had told me that the angels were celebrating my salvation, that the God of the universe knew my name. He knew me, he saw me, and he chose me. It was intoxicating. I leaned into my new belief system with the fervor of any zealot. I was so certain about it all. I had to be certain. After living in fear and chaos and having my very foundation rocked, this new sense of certainty made me feel powerful. It gave me this incredible feeling of safety and security that I had been robbed of. The more devout and dogmatic I became, the more acceptance I gained in my new community. Because of my need for certainty, I now truly believed in eternal damnation for sinners. So of course I had to warn them. In fact, I told everyone. If I overheard kids gossiping at school, I would tell them, "Be careful," or they'd go to hell. I remember hearing a classmate swear in the library, and I stopped what I was doing and anxiously told him he needed to watch himself. He was in danger of going to hell. Didn't he know that? So when I learned that my cousin Edie had come out as gay, I knew I would have to warn her. She was like a sister to me. I couldn't just let her end up in hell. The next time I saw my cousin, her face lit up with love right away. She told me excitedly about everything that was going on in her life, her plans to move to New York City. All the while, I was building up the courage to tell her the truth. There was a pause in the conversation and I pounced. "Edie, I love you, but I can't support your choice to be gay. I believe it's a sin." She was still smiling at me as she processed my words. Then her eyebrows started to come together and her face fell. She didn't respond, but I could see that she was hurt. Really hurt. For the first time, I felt a pinprick of doubt creeping into my certainty, but I shook it off. I had done the right thing, hadn't I? Edie had already heard messages like this, and much worse, from many other people. Her father, a strict Muslim man, believed the solution was to arrange a marriage with another Islamic family in town, whose son had recently come out of the closet. Both young people briefly entertained the suggestion before deciding against it. So I don't think she was surprised by my comment. What did surprise her, though, was who that comment had come from. But I had done the right thing, hadn't I? Of course I loved my cousin. But I told myself, love without truth, it wasn't really love. It's like they say, you can still love the sinner, but you have to hate the sin. And there was help for people who had made these lifestyle choices, right? I'd heard stories about people who had come out as ex-gay. Some were even married now with families, and they all said their sexuality had been a choice. The wrong choice. If I could share that with my cousin, who I loved, maybe I could save her from going to hell. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist's chair. Today, we're diving into the controversial realm of conversion therapy, which is sort of an umbrella term for any therapeutic treatment that seeks to alter someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. We'll get into some of the history and ethics of this soon, but first, I want to introduce you to today's guest, Samuel, who was raised in the Mormon Church and is himself a survivor of conversion therapy. Here's a little background. Sam's mom, the youngest of 12 kids, was born in Puerto Rico, grew up in New Jersey, and then moved to Utah after meeting some Mormon missionaries.
My mom met the missionaries in New Jersey when she was a teenager, and they were these young, attractive boys. And one of her older sisters was like, "Oh, I like this." So she went over to Utah and married a Mormon. And then my mom was like, "There's too much violence here. I really would like a better life. These boys are cute. It seems like I'll probably have a better life if I go to Utah as well." So my mom went to Utah, and that's where she met my father, who is a Mexican immigrant, is still not a citizen. He's working on that. And they met. Unfortunately, my mom was kind of the rebound.
Samuel's dad went back to his old girlfriend, leaving him to grow up with a single mom and what felt like a father-shaped hole in his life.
Because I was raised by a single mother, and everyone around me was this stereotypical Mormon family with a mother and a father and 5 kids, very, very Leave It to Beaver type of family. But then here I was being raised by a single mom. I didn't know you biologically needed a father until I was like 7 years old and the bullying started. And so when I realized that I had a father, but he wasn't in my life, that kind of became like my overarching life story of like, you need a father figure. And the church offered that for me. It offered Mormon male figures to supplant that role. And then when I learned that I had this heavenly father who was always there and I could talk to him whenever I wanted, that was a very comforting thing for me.
While Samuel's mom wasn't super devout or involved in the church, for him it became a refuge. Not only was he drawn to the idea of a heavenly father, the church also offered a potential escape from the bullying he received for his brown skin and for not being like the other boys. Maybe the more righteous he could become, the less he would be bullied.
In the 90s, they were still teaching this doctrine that being a person of color is a curse from God because you're not righteous. And so I got taught over the pulpit that my brown skin was a reflection of my sins, and that if I was more righteous, I could become white like everyone else. And so there was already being taught as a young boy that there's something wrong with me, but if I'm just righteous enough, God will take it away. And so when the bullying started about being brown and also bullying about being gay, it was already being taught to me, well, just be more righteous, and the 2 things that are making your life a living hell will be taken away by God, and it'll be proof that God is real and that you're righteous.
As a teenager, Samuel grew more and more invested in his faith. But he also grew more and more sure that he was gay. He even had a boyfriend at one point when he was 13. So he felt like he was living this double life. Even when he did all of the right things at church and checked all of the boxes of devotion, this wasn't okay. Samuel had a choice to make. You can either be gay or you can be a good Mormon. He chose the church. Boyfriends, they can be mean and unreliable after all, but God was always there. So he doubled down on his faith, trying to leave the whole gay thing behind him. And when he was 18, he embarked on his Mormon mission. This is seen as a pivotal rite of passage. I'm sure you've seen them before, the well-dressed young men knocking on your door, talking about God. And Samuel felt like everything he'd worked for in his faith had been leading to this moment. But surprise, surprise, the gay thing didn't just magically disappear.
Because the way that I dealt with my gay attractions was just by singing more hymns, memorizing more scripture, just becoming more and more busy, more and more devout. But now I didn't have full control over my schedule. I was never allowed to be left alone. And half the time I wasn't alone, it was with a really attractive guy my age. It was very difficult. And when I went to my mission president, the guy who's like in charge of all the missionaries, I confessed that I was struggling with these thoughts. And because he saw that this was there, he called me gay. No one had ever called me gay before that was a leader. So they sent me home to get fixed. So my whole life I was told, just be more righteous, it'll go away. Never did. And now here's this experience where I'm knocking on doors that had been the entire focus of my entire adolescent life. And I'm being sent home early because this demon is still there. And I thought I had beat it, but it's still not. So I have to go to conversion therapy.
In the past, other leaders had told Samuel he was still on the right track, even though he was experiencing temptation. As long as he managed to protect his chastity, he was doing all right. If anything, being tempted meant that he was going to do great things for the church, because Satan was trying to take him out. This time was a different story, though. This time he was told something was fundamentally wrong with him, and he needed to be fixed. Sam's mom had remarried a few years earlier, and now he had a younger brother. It was something he had always wanted, growing up as an only child surrounded by so many big families in Utah. As a missionary, he hadn't been allowed to call his family, so they were surprised when he was sent home earlier than expected. His mom was even more surprised when she found out why he was sent home. Not that Samuel had ever been very stealthy about the fact that he was gay. There were still plenty of clues when he was growing up. But so far, they'd all been able to live in denial and not talk about it. His mom's reaction reaffirmed the idea that there was something deeply wrong with him, something that needed to be guarded against.
She said, I'm no longer comfortable with you being around your little brother anymore, because she thought I was going to molest him. And so to hear my mom say that she thought I would hurt this person that I would die for, I would kill for this kid. And the thought that I would molest him hurt me so much. But what's even worse is that because I was so miserable and I was shocked by the fact that I was still gay, I had really thought that I had beaten it. And so when someone was forcing me to acknowledge that it was still there, I was so shocked. I was like, if I was able to convince myself that I was straight, maybe I really am a pedophile and maybe my mom is right. And I was so ashamed that I was willing to believe anything anyone told me. I felt crazy because clearly I was, because I had this mental disorder according to my paperwork. My mom, who knew me better than anyone, said that I was going to molest my little brother. So, okay, apparently people know me better than I know myself.
Samuel says that's what conversion therapy is all about. Other people telling you things about yourself in a way that fundamentally changes your sense of who you are. After about a week, his mom walked back her concerns. She could see the nurturing bond between Sam and his younger brother and knew it wasn't something to worry about. But Samuel, meanwhile, was in a profound state of turmoil. If he was still gay after so many years of trying not to be, what else might be wrong with him? And could counseling actually help? That was the hope of conversion therapy. Yes, Samuel was told something was fundamentally wrong with him. But he was also told that it could be fixed, that therapy could help him figure out why he was gay and could help him change that part of himself. These ideas go back a long way and have many roots. One of the most pivotal moments came in 1899, when a German psychiatrist announced what seemed like a breakthrough in the treatment of homosexuality. Presenting at a conference, Albert von Schrenck-Notzing declared that after 45 hypnosis sessions and visits to a brothel, he'd been able to redirect a male patient's sexual attraction from men to women. In other words, he had successfully turned a gay man straight. It was off to the races from there. Conversion therapy boomed in the 1900s, and its practitioners employed a wide range of methods. Some used electric convulsive therapy, ice pick lobotomies, and even castration. Others use talk therapy, hypnosis, and family intervention, and many professionals use different forms of aversion therapy. This is when an unwanted stimulus, like arousal towards someone of the same sex, triggers a negative consequence, like electric shock, vomit-inducing chemicals, or a rubber band snapping against your wrist. The idea was that training the body to associate homosexual attraction with pain or nausea would then redirect the energy toward the opposite sex, like Pavlov's dogs in reverse. Professional sentiment around these practices did eventually start to shift. In the 70s, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of disorders. But conversion therapy still had plenty of momentum. In the 90s and early 2000s, the idea that you could fix homosexuality was everywhere. Bookstores, talk shows, and newspapers featured prominent stories of people claiming they used to be gay, but had been healed by some combination of religion and therapy. These ex-gay narratives were championed by groups like Focus on the Family and Exodus International. One of the most famous examples was John and Ann Polk, who were on the cover of Newsweek in 1988 for their story of being happily married to each other, even though they both used to identify as gay. This is not just a matter of distant past. Even preparing to record this episode, I was surprised by conversations with people, including one therapist, who still view conversion therapy in a positive light. Samuel's time in therapy was in the early 2000s, still part of that boom period for ex-gay narratives. The first attempt was through family counseling. Sam went in with both his mom and stepdad, and together they met with a pair of counselors, a man and a woman, who were licensed therapists working for an organization owned by the Mormon Church. These counselors were heavily influenced by Christian leaders like James Dobson, who argued that homosexuality is a problem of child-rearing, often caused by domineering mothers or passive fathers. Samuel says it was easy enough to see both of those gender stereotypes in his parents, at least on the surface. His stepdad was always pretty quiet and didn't say much in session. And his mom, who'd gone her whole life having to fight and take control and assert herself, spent the whole time yelling at Sam and his dad. It was really a pretty miserable experience. The therapists seemed to view them only as stereotypes, and Samuel knew that getting yelled at the whole time was not going to help. So he begged his mom to let him meet with a therapist individually. He told her there were things about his past that he couldn't say in front of her, but he could talk about them privately with someone else. It might help him to move on. And after a few weeks, she agreed.
My very first session of therapy, I remember vividly looking at this thing that I now know is called the Beck scale for depression. And it asks you all these questions like, how sad are you? How often do you have bad thoughts? Yada, 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 just to gauge how depressed you were. But my whole life, I had been taught that if you have Jesus in your heart, people will tell because you're so overwhelmingly happy. So I never allowed myself to be depressed. Yeah, of course I was all the time, but I never allowed it to come out. I always stuffed it down. I always put a smile until the smile was authentic. And so here I was reading this Beck depression score that I had to take every session. And now I was being told because I was happy, I was too prideful and not humble. And that's why I was still gay. And so I needed to allow myself to become depressed. So I did.
Samuel says the overreaching goal with every one of his therapists was very simple: converting him from gay to straight. This always began with the assumption that homosexuality is a mental health disorder, usually caused by bad parenting or childhood trauma. It's a condition in need of a solution, and practitioners will try any theory or methodology they can think of to make it work. When a treatment proves ineffective, they'll simply change tactics and move on to the next method. Or they'll try blaming the patient, asserting that you're being too stubborn or prideful or resistant. You're not trying hard enough to change.
You're not actually able to solve something you can't change. It makes it worse rather than better because you're doing the thing that's supposed to help you, but it's not helping. So who do you have to blame? You, because clearly it helps other people. It helps with OCD, so why isn't it helping you? Well, you're just not trying hard enough. So every therapy technique you try, you get more and more depressed and more shameful because it's supposed to work. They call you a sex addict, so they try things for sexaholics. It doesn't work. So clearly you're really broken. And it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Samuel's first individual therapist, who he saw for about 6 months, focused on gender roles. He asked Sam about growing up without a dad, about his comfort level around other boys, and what it meant to be a man. And when he found out that Samuel was bullied and bad at sports, and that he'd always had a hard time fitting in with other guys, he decided that this is what they needed to zero in on.
All of these things that stereotypical boys would be able to have and love with each other, I always was excluded with because I just never fit in. And I was too effeminate. So I never felt like one of the girls because I didn't like being around the girls and I didn't like the things they did. But at least I wasn't being bullied. So I had to hang out with the girls and learned effeminate things to do. And so I loved the arts. I loved singing. I loved dancing. I loved ballroom. I loved baking. I loved gardening. All these stereotypical, according to them, effeminate things. And so he said, you have gender identity disorder, and essentially labeled me as a transgender woman. And that's what they thought I was. And they said, we just need to help you be more stereotypically male, and then you won't be attracted to boys anymore. And that's the problem. And so I started wearing flannel. I started listening to country music. I didn't play football, but I did at least be like, well, you want me to play sports? Fine, I'll do volleyball and ballroom dancing. Because of course that's hyper masculine, right? I tried. And then I would do gymnastics because it's a sport. Then I lowered my voice. That's what my first therapist was just trying to find more ways to become a stereotypical man.
None of it was working, and Samuel began experiencing a specific type of headache, a psychosomatic reaction that can still be triggered today when he talks about his time in conversion therapy. And the situation at home wasn't helping. Everything felt very rigid, stern, and he was noticing his body would freeze up and start involuntarily shaking whenever his mom yelled at him. Something needed to change.
I asked my therapist for permission. I asked my bishop for permission, and I asked my parents for permission to move out of the house. It's fascinating to see how manipulated I was that an adult thinks he has to have permission from all these people to make a choice for his own life. But I got permission and they were all not happy about it, but they said, whatever, this is your life, but you do have permission, thank God. And so I went to Brigham Young University, and that's when I met the worst therapist that I had.
This new therapist worked very hard to project a sort of hypermasculinity. Sam vividly remembers the fishing rods all over the walls and the way it felt like the therapist hated every moment they had to spend together. He seemed to resent Sam for not being manly enough. His disdain was so intense that it made Samuel wonder if his therapist was a closeted gay man himself. Maybe he envied Sam for being able to act in ways that he could never allow himself. This is conjecture, sure, but it certainly wouldn't be the first time that someone working in conversion therapy turned out to be hiding in the closet. Sometimes it seems like the more vehemently someone rants against gay people or sexual immorality, the more they might have something to hide. The lady doth protest too much, methinks. And remember John Polk? Just a few years after gracing the cover of Newsweek, he was caught visiting a gay bar. His ministry faltered, his marriage eventually crumbled, and now he once again lives as an openly gay man. One of the many ex-gay people who speak out against conversion therapy. Given his therapist's anger, Samuel spent much of these sessions feeling frozen and shaky, as he often did around aggressive and overbearing people. Outwardly, he might nod along and say what the therapist wanted to hear, but inwardly, he'd be wondering how soon he could just get up and leave.
And once he gave me this probably entire session long, so a 50-minute long lecture on the importance of fishing with my father, because that's when boys become men, when they learn these real relationships that men are supposed to have with each other. And he would lecture me about how men are supposed to act with each other, not like pansies, not and then all these slurs type of thing. And he would always be focused on the real healthy relationships I was supposed to have with men. And so he told me to go fishing with my dad. And I'm just like, my dad's in freaking Mexico. And I can barely afford tuition. and I'm eating ramen, and that's too much for me. I can't afford this. And so I begged my other side of the family, the Mexican side of my family, not the Puerto Rican. I begged the Mexican side of my family for money to fly me there. So they flew me there for a week. And what's really sad is that I recorded in my journals, because of course I had to keep a journal, because that's what they want you to do. And I wrote in my journal that my biological father could tell something was off. And he asked me, was I gay? And I told him no, and that I was specifically here to go fishing with him because that was going to make me straight. And he said, well, one, I don't like fishing, but I will love you no matter how you are or who you are. And he was this totally accepting guy for me. And I had only met him once when I was 8, once when I was 18, and then now when I was like 22 or something like that. So my exposure to him was very little. And here he was fully accepting. And in my journal, I wrote, I was extremely depressed. I was devastated because my father wasn't a godly man and I needed a godly father to make me straight.
Samuel finally had a chance to connect with his father, who seemed eager to welcome and affirm him. But his time in therapy told him this was not something to celebrate. He was taught that his father had failed him morally and spiritually, and, okay, here's another trope of conversion therapy. His dad might have even molested him when he was young, and Sam had blocked it out, and maybe that's why he was gay. None of that rang true for Samuel, and none of his therapist's interventions seemed to be affecting much change. It turns out trying to make someone fish with their dad or play basketball with your stepdad, it won't magically make you straight.
And so my therapist at BYU just was frustrated, and he was like, fine, I need you to go buy a Playboy and find a way to pleasure yourself until you can do it every day and enjoy the experience. And what's frustrating is that the Mormons have this sacred temple ceremony where you covenant to never break the law of chastity. Absolutely never. And so that covenant meant a lot to me because I had been through hell to earn that holy Mormon underwear. That was supposed to protect me. And now here's my therapist saying, your entire life's goal, I want you to say, you know what, fuck that. I want you to break your covenants. Say, God, I don't care what covenants I've made to you. I'm now going to buy this dirty magazine and sin because this is what I have to do to be straight. And I just could not stand that. And I never saw him again. And so that's when I turned to a group called Evergreen, which was basically a group of men, and sometimes women, but it was almost 9 times out of 10 men, where they would affirm the LDS church, but the church couldn't officially affirm them, even though they would send church leaders like apostles and authorities from the church leadership to talk at Evergreen. They officially couldn't endorse it. And it was basically formatted after Alcoholics Anonymous, but every time you would talk about alcohol, you would talk about your same-sex attraction disorder. And we couldn't ever identify as gay. Even at the Brigham Young University Honor Code, there was a rule that I couldn't even say I was gay because that was a political identity and that would be against the church. I had to say I struggled with same-sex attraction disorder. And that's how I had to identify. You're now allowed to say that you're gay, but you're not allowed to go on dates whatsoever. You're not allowed to kiss, nothing. You can be gay, you just can't, air quotes, act on it. So they've loosened up. And when I was a Mormon, there was no difference between who you are and what you do. And so any type of reference of homosexuality was the same as if I was having hookups in the club and doing drugs type of thing. That's how they thought about me. And so they thought I was an addict. So I thought I was an addict, even though I was literally chaste ever since I was 13.
Like a lot of men in Evergreen, Samuel was still going to church every week. Still reading scripture morning and night, still praying throughout the day. Then at the meetings, he and other men would cry together about how they were working so hard, checking all the boxes, and they still weren't changing. They talked about going to the gym because they were told they just needed to work it out of their system. But then they'd be turned on by all the hot, sweaty guys around them. So a purported tool for healing became another piece of temptation. It all started to feel like a bait and switch, like every solution offered to them would end up making things worse.
There's this poignant story where I remembered this man that I still love, he's such a sweet spirit. This man started sharing the story of how he prayed in the temple, which for us is like literally God is there and you can talk to him type of thing. And in the temple, God told him that if you fast and pray for 24 hours, I will give you one day where you won't have to deal with this trial of being gay. And so the day was chosen. He did it. And he had been praying and fasting. He didn't eat and didn't drink for 24 hours. Then the day that he was supposed to be blessed, he's walking to class, and not even an hour at the beginning of his day, he's attracted to this guy across the street. And he just started bawling. And I was so distraught because he was more devout than I was. He knew more scriptures. His whole life had been chaste. He didn't have a boyfriend when he was 13, so he was better off than me. And even he couldn't do it. And that, I think, was the beginning of the end for me.
And it wasn't just young guys like Samuel in the group. There were older men with kids who'd been unfaithful to their wives with other men. Some of them were heavily medicated to help dampen their sex drive. They were all desperate and miserable, and Samuel felt like when he looked at them, he was seeing a glimpse of his future.
Evergreen was just showing me that like it wasn't going to work. And so I finally sought out a specialist who apparently was like the person who fixed everybody. He was hella expensive, but he was the best. And he actually did his dissertation for his doctoral degree on men just like me who had beaten homosexuality. And so I go to this expert of experts, and he tells me everything I wanted to hear. That this is just because you're sensitive, which is a good thing because that means you're godly. You are analytical, which means you are very smart and you want to do the right thing. You are very faithful. Like he starts buttering me up and saying that I'm above average intelligent and just telling me everything that you would want to hear, especially when you've been so downtrodden. And so rather than being bullied by my own therapist, I'm now again being cared for, finally. But then when I go to him, he's the first therapist that finally admits that you actually can't get rid of homosexuality. You just push it away. And I was livid because I was doing all this work with him. And now you're telling me that this one thing, the whole reason I've been doing this for a year and a half, isn't even possible, according to the research. Then why am I here? And he's like, well, you just have to walk away from it. And I wanted to scream, what do you think I've been doing my whole life? I have been walking away from it, but it catches me when I least expect it, and I can't be perfect. And I knew that if I didn't just destroy this thing, I was going to be exactly like those men. I was going to be fine, thinking I was having a good life, and then the wrong person would come in my life. I would be weak, I would cheat on my wife, and I would destroy my whole family. I knew it was going to happen because I saw it happen for so many other people. And it's not like I'm more special than anyone else. I'm just pretty damn average. And so when he told me that, something clicked in my brain because there's this thing that he said, I want you to understand. He had this theory that the reason I became gay is because I was so different from the other boys as a young child that when I started to mature, the thing that was still different from me were the other boys, not the girls. And so for the boys, the thing that's different were the girls, so they started to become attracted to them. And so I became attracted to the boys because they were different. And so what I needed to do was recognize that it was like singing the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. He said, you have sung that song so many times, I can say Rudolph the Red-Nosed, and you immediately think of what? And I'd be like, cow? Reindeer, right? Reindeer, right? Because you've done it so many times. And he's like, that's the thing. He's like, being married to a woman is like singing the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Buffalo. It's going to feel really weird, maybe even a little gross at first. But the thing is you just got to keep singing that song. And eventually you will just be so used to singing that song that maybe once in a while that old song with reindeer will come up. But because you hyper focus on being perfect, the problem is not that you sang the Rudolph song. The problem is that you focus on your mistakes. Just move on. Just keep singing that Buffalo song and you'll be okay. And I realized in that moment that he admitted to me that it will never go away. I have been singing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Mormon my whole life. And maybe I don't have to sing that song anymore.
This therapist was essentially telling Samuel he couldn't fix his gayness, but maybe he could gaslight himself into living a surface-level straight life. As a side note, the writer for this podcast, Bo, says he encountered similar messages growing up. Bo was never formally in conversion therapy, and he didn't come out of the closet until he was 30. But in college, he told a Christian counselor that he was attracted to men and worried he might be gay. The counselor told him to push it down, just focus on girls instead. And if that doesn't work, focus only on God. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, and Samuel started to wonder. If he had to choose between being gay and being Mormon, maybe it was time to take a step back from the church. Not that this was an easy decision at all. Faith had been everything for Samuel. The church gave him a father figure, a haven from bullying, and a sense of family and purpose. The idea of walking away from it all was devastating, but something had to give.
So what I did is I gave myself a year trial because I heard of, even though it's not true that this always happens for the Amish, but I did hear that there was this Amish thing, this Rumspringa where you could like test out the world type of thing. And since that's what I heard of, I figured, well, why don't I refuse going to church for a year, air quotes, live a gay lifestyle, just accept myself as gay and see what happens. Maybe date, maybe not, but just see what happens if I don't have God in my life for a year. And I assumed that if living gay was truly wrong, I at least would have experienced it so I would know what I was leaving behind. That would give me the strength to stay on the straight and narrow path and that God would call me back. But after a year, I was still confused because I missed the church, but the air quotes gay lifestyle didn't fit me either because I didn't want what we typically do in the queer community, at least with gay men. Lots of hookup culture, lots of drag shows, lots of drinking, lots of partying. I liked going to the temple for fun. I liked reading my scriptures for fun. That's the type of person that I was. And so it was a shock for me to have all of this freedom and have no idea how to handle it. But I knew enough after that year-long trial that something wasn't working and the church probably isn't true. So I resigned rather than having them excommunicate myself.
Samuel still wrestled with his faith over the next several years. You don't just walk away overnight from something that core to who you are. But the more he started reading about psychology, sociology, and science, the more distant the church seemed, and the more he felt like he might be okay living as a gay man. He tried seeking counseling to work through his conversion therapy harm, but even walking into a therapist's office was triggering and overwhelming. It didn't feel safe, and it's hard to find healing in a place that was the site of so much harm. Years later, living in Washington now, Samuel went to grad school to become a therapist himself. Several people in the program were Mormons, including the director, and the harm from his past started to feel very present again. But he knew he couldn't go back to therapy, and he eventually decided he didn't want to work as a therapist either. The more he learned about the field, the more he felt like too much of it was historically laced with racism, misogyny, and homophobia. But thankfully, one-on-one counseling isn't the only way to pursue healing.
I found a support group for people who survived conversion therapy, and I will say that's when things changed. Because I heard stories that were exactly like mine, or were so much like mine, but slightly different, that I was able to see how crazy this shit is. Because I could be like, that is torture. And then when I would see so clearly what they went through was torture, I was allowed to admit to myself that so was I.
Samuel now lives in Washington with his husband, who's also a survivor of conversion therapy. He's more grounded in his identity these days, and he likes feeling like he doesn't have to change who he is or push part of himself away. But the wounds run deep, and they do so for many people. Survivors of conversion therapy are often at high risk of depression, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation because of the harm they've endured. So Samuel attends a support group every week, and he channels his energy into advocacy, fighting to build community for survivors and raise awareness about the destruction caused by conversion therapy. And that is very much an ongoing battle. Even though the medical and psychological communities have thoroughly denounced conversion therapy as both ineffective, unethical, and harmful, it's still practiced in different forms today, often under the guise of religion. 26 states and more than 100 individual municipalities have banned conversion therapy for minors, and some places have extended that ban to adults. But practitioners can still try to employ similar principles under different names and with different methods. And even though a state licensing board or professional organization like the APA can bar its members from offering conversion therapy, those rules don't necessarily apply in realms like pastoral counseling. The rules are different everywhere you go. And it gets even trickier when you talk about coercion and consent. Samuel says he has a hard time making sense of that, even in his own story. Family and religious pressure can definitely muddy the definition of coercion, but he was a legal adult during his time in therapy, and no one was dragging him to sessions. But the informed part of informed consent was severely lacking. No one warned him about the trauma and potential harm of conversion therapy. What's more, he was promised that it would work. He would end up straight. When he found out that wasn't possible, that his gayness wasn't just a switch he could flip or a choice he could unmake, it was like a slap in the face. He entered therapy under false pretenses, and he went through all that painful work only to find out it was a lie. That's why he wants to spread the word and help as many people as possible who have survived similar stories. You can learn more about that work at conversiontherapydropout.com. And you can find more stories about conversion therapy in books like Boy Erased and The Miseducation of Cameron Post, both of which have been turned into movies. There's also a podcast series from Radiolab called Unerased, all about the history of conversion therapy, and a documentary on Netflix called Pray Away. Trust me, I could go on. There are so many stories out there. Thank you, Samuel, for bravely sharing your story of conversion therapy harm. Your courage in speaking out will undoubtedly help others facing similar struggles. To my cousin Edie, thank you for showing me more love, grace, and forgiveness than I ever deserved. And a special thanks to Matthew, otherwise known as Mixed Domestic, for their advocacy work and their creation of the Therapy Map Quilt, which highlights in stark gray the states that have not yet banned conversion therapy for minors. The quilt is a beautiful symbol and a powerful tool for sparking conversation and promoting acceptance. Mixed Domestics advocacy extends beyond crafting, as they use their platform to raise awareness about important social issues, including the harm of conversion therapy. Follow Mixed Domestic on social media to see their latest creations and learn more about their advocacy efforts. We'll post a link to their page in the show notes. And to our listeners, if you have found value in today's episode, please show your support for our mission by leaving a rating and review.